that I welcome this kind of examination.
We tortured some folks. The CIA is fundamental to America's national security.
There's a war going on, the battlefield's in the mind, and the prize is the soul.
I don't believe anything the government tells me.
But I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never.
Hi, I am Irv Kopi, host of Movie Theater. Joe Brand and I agree.
Wait a minute, I want a woman.
All right, Cincinnati, it is time for this town to get down.
This is the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hello, this is Adam Gorightly. You're listening to the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
And thank you, Adam. Hey, we really need to get Adam back on this show. He was so interesting and has such a wide, weird range of knowledge. We definitely need to do that. So, hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm S.T. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing and traversing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, the court historians, and the textbook conglomerates that control information today. Well, tonight, I'm sorry it's been a few months, but tonight we do have episode 163, Kevin Corley on Bootleggers, the KKK, and the Mob. The guest tonight is author Kevin Corley, who you may have seen in Garrison, and wow, does he have a story for you. First, however, let us clean this castle, shall we? So Garrison issue 9 is available. Richard Booth contributed the cover story looking at the FBI failures in the investigation of the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing of the Murrah Federal Building. And folks, believe me, if you don't remember the John Doe number 2 story, wow, you really need to read this article. What Richard does and what Richard continues to do on this Oklahoma City bombing story is story changing. It really is. And so that is vital. But we also have contributions from Caitlin Johnstone and Edgar Tatro and Susan Abernethy and Robert Getlin and Jeremy Kuzmarov, Jonathan Cook, Meg Sherman, and of course yours truly. We also printed the entire UN resolution against fascism that, of course, the U.S. and the Ukraine voted against and voted against alone. We have that entire text and the vote, so you could see just what they voted against. It is amazing stuff. And for those interested in historical anniversaries, and I'm assuming that since you're all here, you are, in late May or early June, approximately, we will release Watergate at 50, an issue devoted entirely to the 50th anniversary of the Watergate break-ins. The cast is great. Everyone that you would hope to be in there is going to be in there. So you can imagine, your humble host is excited about that. And, well, hey, we opened a radio station. Yes, because I needed one more project, right? I know a lot of you are screaming at me right now, do more episodes of the show. Forget the radio station. And I'm going to try to do both. I really am. But, yes, it is music. And no, this isn't a Spotify playlist that just randomizes all day. We do have actual DJs that will be doing actual shows. And we'll be debuting some locally hosted shows as well. I'll be hosting a few of them. And we have contracted with some syndication companies to run some very well-known national shows too. The website is www.wstpradio.com. That is wstpradio.com. I said that slowly, so hopefully everyone can jot that down, or just rewind this and you can jot that down. You can listen live there for now, but in the next few weeks, we'll also have an Android app, an iPhone app, and you'll be able to use Alexa to just say, "Hey Alexa, play STP Radio." So hopefully that will happen very soon too. The music is... Well, it's really an approximation. I'm going to say late 60s through mid 90s. We were basically thinking Generation X, but I'm sure anyone outside those generations could enjoy it as well, and hopefully will. Our motto is reliving your greatest memories one song at a time. So you can imagine what we're trying to do. We were really big fans of radio as kids and teens, and we wanted to start something that really took us back to when radio was special. We think we have done just that, and we hope you'll join us at WSTP Radio I just messed that up. WSTPradio.com. The schedule is there as well if you do want to see what shows we're running right now. So thank you very much for that. And again, it really takes us back to a time where we used to hide radios under our pillows so our moms didn't know, and we used to try to pick up those stations farthest away overnight when you could on the AM dial, and we knew all of the DJs on our favorite top 40 FM station. We knew their schedules. We just were so into radio, and we're trying to bring back that feeling. I also just returned from attending the JFK Historical Group Project JFK conference in Olney, Illinois. Fantastic. It was smaller than usual, but I think everyone was excited to have gotten out of the house and to share what they've been working on for 2 years. It was really a lot of Watergate tie-ins, which are important in this year, but there are also 3 what I call My Daddy Told Me stories. And they were relayed to us by the famous Robert Groden, the famous J. Gary Shaw, and Shauna Gale Willis. All 3 of them relayed stories. I know that Robert Groden has been working on the story of Oris Bell for quite a long time, and J. Gary Shaw has been working with Roscoe White's son, Ricky White, for quite some time, and Shauna Gale Willis is telling the story of her own father. I'm sure you'll be hearing more about those stories soon, and we'll try to get them on the show as well. So that was pretty much the talk of the conference, and Edgar Tatro gave a great presentation on Leon Jaworski, a story which you'll read in the Watergate issue of the magazine. So, all of that said, hello, glad to be back. We'll be right back with Kevin Corley.
Roswell, Area 51 and Bob Lazar, MJ-12, JFK, Art Bell, 9/11, Disclosure, and what's really happening on the moon. The great John Lear joined us to talk about all of this and more.
Hi, this is John Lear. If you want to know how my experiences took me to the alternative side of history and how they both planted me in the middle of the Bob Lazar story, download episode 11 of the Midnight Rider News Show.
The great John Lear, the godfather of conspiracy. And John, unfortunately, just passed away a few weeks ago, and we're so sorry to hear that. Thoughts go out to his friends and family. Those 2 episodes that I did with John are 2 of my favorite episodes of this show, and they'll always be special to me. John answered every single question, and we asked him a lot of questions. So please go to MidnightRiderNews.com and listen to episode 011. That's the 11th episode. I say to go to the website because I know on Apple iTunes, I'm not sure how it is on any of the other podcatchers, but on Apple iTunes, it really only posts the most recent 100 episodes. So since we are past that point, episode 11 might not be there. So you may have to go to the website where every single episode is archived and you can access them for free. So John in that episode tells the longest version of the Bob Lazar story that I ever heard John tell. And that includes his appearances on Art Bell's Coast to Coast back in the 90s. So it is legendary. You definitely want to hear that. Now tonight, I hesitate to reveal too much about this story before Kevin begins, but I will say that this is a story without protagonists. This is a story without heroes. Yet it demanded of its characters loyalty to someone. And that was pretty difficult for many residents of Southern Illinois. In fact, it was one of the most difficult decisions that they ever had to make because everybody was problematic. So let's just get right into it, and I'll fill in as we go along where I need to. This is Kevin Corley. Kevin, thank you so much for being on the show tonight.
Oh, thanks for asking me. I appreciate it.
Well, first, I want to thank you for writing for Garrison 2 excellent articles. And, this story, I think many people out there may not know, but we're going to go ahead and get this out there right away. You and I are from the same area of southern Illinois, which is why we have a keen interest in the story. Yet it's sort of what I call a microcosm story. It really applies to the whole nation, because the nation in the Prohibition era, everywhere you turn, churches and farmers and miners were dealing with the same sorts of things that we're going to talk about tonight, and also the rise of the KKK and organized crime, all at once, all in the same places. So before we begin the tale of Charlie Birger, the Shelton Gang, the KKK, how did you first really get interested in the story?
Yeah, I'd love to tell you about that. And I've told it enough times I can usually be pretty precise. I'm a retired history teacher, and when I taught history to high school students in Christian County, Illinois, they would always ask me about some of the things I told them about local history. We were the beginning of the United Mine Workers of America and John L. Lewis, and there was lots and lots of bombings and murders in the 1930s as those things got started. And they said to me, Mr. Corley, that can't be true. If it was, it would be a book or a movie. So when I retired in about 2004, I wrote the book 16 Tons about coal mine development in Christian County and central Illinois, and somehow a publisher got hold of it. We don't even know for sure how. And Tim Sheard with Hardball Press and asked if he could publish it. And I was just amazed, that happened. So anyway, he published that one. Then he did a sequel to it called Throw Out the Water. And it all tells the incredible story of the coal mine wars from 1898 to 1938. Well, one of the stories that was in there that got us into what we're talking about today was a situation where the Shelton Gang of Southern Illinois, which were bootleggers, came up robbing banks around this area, north of where they were from, and they came to central Illinois and tried to rob a bank in Kincaid, Illinois. And when they did, everybody in the town came out of their houses with guns and started shooting at them. Well, they dropped the money, let go of the bank, their hostage bank teller that they had, and two of them got shot and were later tried in Taylorville, Illinois, and found innocent, because back then, of course, criminals were kind of the heroes. But so many people asked me about that incident and about the Shelton Gang that I decided to tell their story too. So after I had written 3 books on Christian County coal mine history, I did write 13 Steps for Charlie Birger, which was published a few years ago. And it tells about Charlie Birger himself and how he became a bootlegger, and incredible stories, which I'm going to hopefully tell you tonight.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And to set the scene for all of our great listeners out there, imagine, if you will, a map of Illinois in your mind. And I hope you can do that. Cut it horizontally into thirds. Now, the top third is very much, still to this day, dominated by Chicago. The second third by Springfield and Peoria. Right. And then the bottom third contains East St. Louis and the Belleville area. Correct. Carbondale and Marion. It's the section, the bottom third, the southern third, is the section often termed Little Egypt, even though we do still mispronounce Cairo as Cairo.
Sure.
Small things, I know. Now, while we will discuss the middle third and the lower third, most of the action tonight will occur in southern Illinois from what is now I-64 and south.
Yeah.
So even in that bottom third in southern Illinois, Kevin is from the northern part that the Sheltons controlled. I'm from Franklin County, which is near Herrin and Williamson County, which will also be important this evening. And Franklin County was controlled by the infamous Charlie Birger and his gang. So for us, when we were kids, the Birger story loomed larger than the stories about the Shelton gang. I'm sure for Kevin, it was the opposite. So let's begin with Southern Illinois pre-Prohibition, before there was a Shelton gang, before there was a Birger gang, before the rise of the KKK, and before there was a Herrin Massacre. What was Southern Illinois like then?
All right. Yeah, that's a good question. To understand it, as you know, the bottom counties in Southern Illinois, it forms kind of a triangle there with the Ohio River and the Mississippi River. And the that little area down there has a town called Cairo. And so named after, I suppose, in Egypt. And so the people of that area are call that area Little Egypt. And it's a lowland. If you've studied your history, you know that Colonel Clark went through there with his men, the Rangers, and they went through the swamps, which is because it is a lowland. If people don't know Illinois very well, the top half of Illinois was leveled by glaciers, and the bottom half is hilly and has lowlands. So that tells you just a little bit about what it's like. Now, the people that lived there were the hardy frontiersman type. They were tough, and they had to be to live in that type of area. So that is why when Prohibition came in 1920, the people down there were drinkers. They wanted to drink their alcohol. And so when they told them they couldn't, a lot of them were Italians and French, and they made their own wines. And Charlie Birger, in fact, Al Capone came down to that area several times to recruit prostitutes, for one, and to get alcohol from the Italians and the bootleggers that were down there, including Charlie Birger and the Shelton Gang. So he even made a deal with them later that said, you guys stay south of Peoria and stay out of Chicago, and we'll get along just fine.
Right, and I think that the agreement with Capone gave both the Sheltons and the Birger Gang a license to be wild, and it got wild quickly.
Sure.
But Prohibition's an interesting thing, Kevin. Now, I've often wondered, and I'm going off topic here a little bit, although it does relate, I've often wondered if the drug-related violence at the Mexican border that we have in the Americas throughout the 1980s, 1990s now, I've often wondered if that was in part because we made drugs illegal on such a wide scale. I wonder if we didn't learn from Prohibition that illegality makes a commodity more attractive, and then there exists a burgeoning black market with vacuums of leadership, control, and supply that have to be filled.
And, you know, that's right. And you know what? It's interesting you say that, because at the beginning of my book, 13 Steps for Charlie Birger, I have one of the Shelton brothers says, I think it's great that they're trying to legalize or make this illegal to have alcohol, because that just opens the door for gangsters, and we can make lots of money off of it. And that's what they did. You are correct. Every time that the government tries to legislate morality, it opens the door for criminals like the Birgers and the Sheltons.
Well, I still wonder how the opposite would have changed our culture. Now, everyone out there might be a little surprised to hear this. I'm not a drinker. I've never been a drinker, and I've never tried an illegal drug in my life, so I'm pretty straight edge as far as that goes, although I don't really like the terminology of that. But anyway, the point is, I wonder what it would have been if drugs would have been legal and regulated and you could buy them at a Walgreens or a CVS. I wonder what the Miami Vice era of 1984, 1985, 1986 in South Florida would have been like if it was more profitable for a kid to stand on a corner and sell a box of apples as opposed to cocaine. I wonder how that would have completely changed our culture.
The gangsters in my book make that exact argument. And remember, Southern Illinois didn't just have bootlegging; it also had gambling and prostitution. And now, let me tell you a little bit about Charlie Birger. He was a handsome man. He was born in 1881, and he went out west and was in the cavalry. He was a bronco buster. He probably a cowboy, and he probably even did a little bit of cattle rustling. But when the coal mines opened in the early 1900s, he saw an opportunity to make money there. So he came back and tried his hand at coal mining, but it didn't work too good because he was one of the easy route. And bootlegging allowed a lot of these guys who were all coal miners at one time or the other an opportunity to make big money by not working as hard physically, if that makes sense. So they the thing that's interesting about all this is that the Birgers and Sheltons at first were just kind of separate from each other. You know, as you described, where Herrin is kind of in the middle, and you've got Harrisburg is where Charlie's from, and he's a hero there because in Harrisburg, Illinois, he walks around and he pays for everything with $2 bills, and he hands out coins to children, and he even goes out in the middle of the night and leaves buckets of coal and groceries on the porches of folks who've fallen on hard times. And if you want to picture him, it's easy to do because in the 1960s, late 60s, they were going to make a movie about Charlie Birger, and the guy that was going to star in it, Frank Sinatra. And so if you see Frank Sinatra, you're looking at Charlie Birger, basically, because they did look similar. And Dean Martin was supposed to play Carl Shelton.
He was a handsome guy. I can definitely see why people were naturally drawn to him. And yet it's another lesson in history, Kevin, because the street gangs of the 1960s, the 1970s, 1980s, they used to also do charitable work within their communities that built up a certain level of goodwill. And yes, all before going out and killing one another. But there was a real effort to build up the churches and the single mothers and the homeless kids in those areas. And goodwill isn't the only thing that's built. Now, let's be honest here. They're also buying protection, because who's going to rat them out to police when they're receiving money from the gang to buy groceries or help pay for their electricity? Hey, he's helping my aunt and uncle. I'm not going to turn him in. I mean,
right.
That's how it was, right?
Right. And he also would not allow crime in his community, which is kind of, there was a boy named Joe Chestnut who killed a postmaster, and when they couldn't get him to admit what he had done, so when they threw him in jail, he walks in, and guess who's sitting there? Charlie Birger. And Charlie says, "Oh, I'm just paying my monthly respects to the sheriff. He always throws me in here once in a while." And he says, "What'd you do, Joey?" And Joey is just so mesmerized by being in the cell with Charlie Birger that he tells him the whole story. And then a few minutes later, the deputy comes and says, "Charlie, the sheriff wants to talk to you." And Charlie goes in and tells the sheriff and the state's attorney everything Joe Chestnut had done. And soon after that, Joe Chestnut was hanged. So that's the type of guy we're dealing with here.
My gosh, it was just a different time then. It's so very hard to explain when everyone out there sort of seems, things have never been worse than they are now. There was a time in America, there was a time in the South, there's a time in the country, in these small country towns, where there was a lot of lawlessness and just abject violence. And even the application of law was very tenuous and controlled by those who broke the law the most. And so, but there was a feeling, there was a sort of gang time, organized crime sort of feeling that those who were sort of involved in the abject violence really chose to be within that circle. Is that true?
Right. And, the thing that people don't understand is that everybody down in that southern Illinois part was taking one side or the other, it seemed like. My grandfather, when he was 84 years old, was telling me about how he was in the Southern Illinois Ku Klux Klan. I said, "Granddad, you always told me that to treat black people the same and everything. Why were you in the Ku Klux Klan? You didn't like black people?" He said, "Oh, no, I didn't mind the black people. We didn't like those damn Catholics and their drinking and gambling." So he was a Southern Baptist, and they were against the drinkers and gamblers. And that's what brings us to the Birger gang and the Shelton gang came together to fight the Ku Klux Klan. And the Ku Klux Klan had a leader named Glenn Young, who Anybody that's listening could Google these names and see photographs of them. I'm looking at one right now that's got Charlie Birger sitting on top of his car holding a Tommy gun, and all his gangsters are all around him. You'll see that one. You can see one of Glenn Young holding a Tommy gun, or actually it was a Enfield rifle, and he's got pearl-handled pistols on his hips. These times were more violent and more. It was everything that people imagined the Old West to be in the 1880s. And that's what was going on in Southern Illinois during this time period.
Well, let's actually step back for a moment and take listeners down this road to gangsterism that we're in right now. How does Charlie Birger become a gang leader? How does Carl Shelton become a gang leader? And I guess let's begin with Charlie Birger, who has an interesting origin. Born to Jewish parents in the Russian Empire and born under the name Shakhnai Itzik Birger in 1881. And to put that into context for listeners, that's 16 years after the end of the American Civil War. But how does Charlie Birger gain that infamy for which we know him today?
Right, that's correct. He was the more violent one. Charlie liked to have a large gang. He had a dozen or more people around him at all times, and they all would practice with their guns and their rifles and bomb making. And the Sheltons, on the other hand, had a small gang. They never slept in the same place 2-3 nights in a row. They were always moving around. They really got their start in East St. Louis they were all bank robbers. They were all besides bootleggers. They did lots of other things. And when they started their roadhouses and a gambling and prostitution, that's when they really made all their money, both groups. And of course, sooner or later, those two groups are going to wind up clashing. So that tells you just a little bit about both of them. Did that answer your question well enough, or did you?
Well, sure. And I think that difference is not only did the Sheltons have a smaller gang, but also the Sheltons were a family. So I think they were a little bit more closed off to the outside, and they sort of wanted to keep things in-house.
He was a businessman. He didn't look like a gangster. His group was mostly his family. If you look at pictures of them, if you Google it, you'll see a picture of them just look like a family getting ready to go to church, and they did. These people went to church every Sunday, bought their own booths in the back that they sat at, and if they didn't have somebody to kill on Sunday, they were always there. Carl actually played the piano in the church and the organ, and he even taught Sunday school. But at the same time, he was not afraid to send somebody out to kill somebody.
Yeah, it really is amazing reading your books. 13 Steps for Charlie Birger, which is about the Birger Gang, and then Bootlegger Heaven, which is about the Shelton Gang. And you also have the novel Sundown Town, Throw Out the Water in 16 Tons. But specifically in reading the Shelton works and the Birger works, there's... On one page, they're going to church and, as you said, singing in the choir or playing the organ. And on the next page, they're hunting someone down in cold blood.
Right. Oh, there's great stories about that. Yeah, the things that they did.
Right. And I want to get into a few of these stories. Tell us one example, or give us one good example, where the Birger Gang and the Shelton Gang really clashed over one person or one issue or some event.
Well, one of the main issues, you have to bring a woman into this, right? Helen Holbrook. Helen Holbrook was a beautiful, blonde-haired, sophisticated, wealthy woman, a young woman, too. And she loved having affairs with gangsters. And her first guy that was famous that she became involved with was Charlie Birger. Some people thought that if they made a movie, Angie Dickinson would have been a perfect person to play her role. And she and her girlfriend, they called the Blonde Bombshell. We never have known who she was, really. One time, the gangsters brought them a dead body. And they just thought that was the coolest thing on earth. and they put it up on top of Helen's roof and partied with it every night. So that's the type of people we're talking about. And then finally one day when they came out to dress him for their party, the animals, the birds and things had eaten his face, so they finally buried him and had a great big ceremony for him, even though he was a gangster they didn't like. The Shelton Gang liked to hire out some of the gangs in St. Louis, if you've heard of the Egan Rats or the Cuckoo Gang, it was what they were called. And they would hire them out to do most of their dirty work. That way, he didn't have a large army like Charlie did. One time, the Shelton Gang, Earl and Bernie were the two brothers that were with Carl, and they got a guy up in Peoria, and in that Renaissance motel, that big, beautiful, tall Renaissance motel is about 9 stories. They were trying to get him to talk, so they put a sheet around him and hung him outside the window and started cutting the sheet and said, you'll tell us what we want to know or you're going to fall to your death. So that's one of the stories about them.
Well, let's bring the KKK into the story at this time, and I can tell you, Kevin, being an active reader, part of being an active reader is really investing yourself in the story. And I think that American readers especially seek a protagonist for whom that they can root and cheer throughout the story. But when you try to do that with this story, you're in quite the precarious situation.
Yes.
And I say that about The Great Gatsby as well, by the way, that no character in The Great Gatsby is really purely likable. So it's very hard to get behind anyone. But as much as I say that about Gatsby, in this story it's even worse. The uneasy part of this is that you're forced to make some choices as a reader at pivotal moments in the story that will make you uncomfortable. But that said, let's talk about the KKK. And as you alluded to earlier, to this day, that third of Illinois does not have a large African-American population, although there is a sort of presence of the KKK that sort of pops up randomly once every 10 years or so. But at the time in our story, at the time of Prohibition, it's really rising nationally in power and in volume. So we see the same thing in Southern Illinois, which is, again, a microcosm of what's going on in the country at this point. And what we see in Southern Illinois, though, is we see the KKK in both the face and the character of one Glenn S. Young. Tell us about him.
Well, yeah, the interesting thing that people don't realize is the KKK has had 3 major movements throughout their history. The first one, of course, was right after the Civil War. The second one occurred after 1915 when a guy named D.W. Griffith made a movie, one of the first epic silent movies called Birth of a Nation. And when that came out, in these neighborhoods like you're talking about in Little Egypt, when that movie was shown in a theater downtown, KKK members would literally get on horses and costumes and ride through town, yelling it out that the movie's here. Birth of a Nation. Everybody has to come down and see it. And so that caused the second major movement of the Ku Klux Klan in the United States. And it was predominantly in Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, kind of here our Bible Belt, I guess you'd call it. And they were mostly Baptists, Southern Baptists, a few Methodists and things. And they were against the Catholics, like I said, because the Catholics allowed drinking and alcohol. And that's when the Shelton and Birger gangs wound up having to team up together to fight the Ku Klux Klan. And as you know, there were major gun battles in Southern Illinois. You can still go down to Herrin, where you're from, and go to some of the buildings and see bullet holes from some of the gunfights. So that kind of tells you what was going on. And of course, what happens is, if you want me to get into that, is the Ku Klux Klan leader Glenn Young had a beautiful young wife, Maud, and he was so ruthless with the Shelton and Birger gangs. He would round up bootleggers at roadhouses around Christmas time, which is when they're all out drinking, and he would round up 100 of them or two at a time and put them in Benton, Illinois, at the courthouse. But he had to put on a big show. Glenn Young would parade his prisoners, hundreds of prisoners, around the square, and then have them go into the courthouse one at a time and be processed. And then, of course, they were released on bail and things. But he was so ruthless in how he did things that even the Ku Klux Klan finally said, "You're too tough. You're too much for us." So they were going to send him down to East St. Louis. And on the day he left, it was Herrin, Illinois. He and his wife had a real nice Cadillac car, and I think it was Cadillac. I might be wrong, but they were getting in the car, and he stood up on the board. Glenn Young's not a real tall guy, but he's, like I said, he's always got his guns on him and everything. And he says goodbye to a crowd of thousands of people, of Ku Klux Klan people who came out to say goodbye to him. Well, he and his wife are driving down the Kaskaskia River bottoms over toward Carlisle and that area, and the Shelton Gang drive up behind him and shoot at his car. He gets wounded, Glenn Young does, and his wife is blinded by a shotgun blast to her face, blinded for the rest of her life. So anyway, that's just one of the stories about how they were able to defeat the Ku Klux Klan. Within a year, there was a big election, and if you can imagine this, in those cities down there, the Ku Klux Klan were riding around in cars with Tommy guns, trying to keep the Baptists from going to the polls, and trying to get the Catholics to all go and vote, because that was on their side. And the Shelton and Birger gangs were riding around in cars, trying to keep the Catholics from voting. And of course, it wound up with couple of major gun battles that several people were killed. And eventually, Earl Shelton was the guy who the Shelton Gang, he was really mad at one of the leading Ku Klux Klan members named Caesar Cagle, and he caught him one night with and killed him. And so the Ku Klux Klan went after the gangs and chased them into a into a hospital, where they had a major gun battle until 2 a.m. And finally the National Guard was brought in and separated them, and pretty much was the end of the Ku Klux Klan after some of those events.
The struggle here is a fascinating one, as we said. So you have the Birger and the Shelton gangs on one side. They're sworn enemies, and they're on the same side against the KKK, at least in the era of Prohibition. The gangs believe in some way that they're on the side of liberation when it comes to temperance, yet they also have to know, as we said earlier, that the moment this Prohibition ends, the profit that they're taking in from the alcohol trade, that's done.
Right.
But then on the other hand, you have the KKK, who truly believe that they're on the side of right, the side of Christian morality. And the KKK, out of all organizations, are really playing the morality card here. And so we then have these gangster anti-heroes, which is exactly how I believe they saw themselves, versus the KKK, who no doubt saw themselves as the heroes and keepers of this Christian tradition, at least when it comes to alcohol and drunkenness. So the question I have for you is, did you struggle with this at all as a writer in trying to define this?
Oh, sure. What I found was there's good and there's bad in all of these characters. There's things that they'll do that you'll think that is really nice, and the next minute, like you said, they're killing somebody. But the Glenn Young story, he believed he was morally right. And I want to say this is very important, I think, for you and other people to understand. At this second wave of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, it wasn't just Republicans and Democrats or liberals and conservatives. There were people from both sides who believed that you should be allowed to drink. There were people from both sides that believed you shouldn't be drinking. A lot of course, the women didn't want their men to get drunk anymore. Alcohol was so prevalent in the United States that they were fighting to get their men to go with them to these meetings and things to fight against the alcohol But in the next, later that night, when the men would sneak out and have their drinks. So, yeah, there's good and bad in all the characters.
One of the more interesting aspects of this story is really this sort of battle for control of the law. It seems like every sheriff in every county in this area was controlled by either the Birgers, the Sheltons, or the KKK. Give us a few examples, if you would, of this sort of struggle for law enforcement.
That's right. That's right. The Shelton and Birgers would buy off the law. In fact, the Sheltons had bought off most of the law in East St. Louis, and then later in Peoria when they had that in the 1940s. But Birger himself had his police friends in Saline County down in southern Illinois. And what thing that's interesting is one of the Shelton Gang members, Ora Thomas, he'd been in the Birger Gang. He was he was friends with Charlie Birger. He winds up with the Sheltons also, because, against the Ku Klux Klan, but he was also a deputy sheriff. And so one day, Charlie Birger set up a gunfight between Ora Thomas and Glenn Young. And they met in a cigar store there in Herrin, Illinois, and had just a typical Western gunfight and killed each other. And meanwhile, Charlie was shooting bullets in from outside and shot two of Glenn Young's guards. So that's kind of the, and what's funny is they were both buried. Glenn Young had a great big fancy Ku Klux Klan burial with 80,000 people came from around the country for Glenn Young's funeral. And Ora Thomas then had his people, the Catholic peoples and stuff that buried him, and they're buried right now within a stone's throw away from each other down in Herrin, Illinois.
Yes, we have a picture of Glenn Young's funeral, the KKK funeral, in the last issue of Garrison, and it is an amazing thing to see. It is just bizarre, and it's hard to even realize that is southern Illinois, the place that we're from. But it did happen. It absolutely did happen. Now, wasn't there some part of this story between Thomas and Young where one of them go to the hospital and then the other gang members actually chase them into the hospital?
Sure. Ora Thomas had set up a group of people to fight an anti-Ku Klux Klan group. And they had a meeting at the Rome Club in Herrin, Illinois. They had 80 members there. And there was an accidental discharge of a gun or something and shot one of the deputies, the city deputies. Well, the men then went out walking through town looking for Ku Klux Klan members, and they found Caesar Cagle. And Earl was mad at Caesar anyway because he pistol whipped him during one of the Ku Klux Klan arrests. And Earl shot and killed him. And then all those people went to the hospital for a couple of their friends that were there. And while they were there, that's when Glenn Young rounded up 1,000 Ku Klux Klan members and tried to get into the hospital. And that's where they had that gunfight until 2 a.m. when the National Guard came.
I think this is a good moment to go into the Herrin Massacre. Now, for those who grew up in southern Illinois like you and I did, there are pretty much two events that you hear about historically throughout your entire childhood. The first is the debate at Jonesboro between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas.
Right.
The Lincoln-Douglas debates that occurred all over Illinois are something that are still talked about today nationally. The other was a national story. The Herrin Massacre becomes a national story covered in national papers. It is tragic, but it is a little different than anything you've heard of before. So if you would, Kevin, please, let's really hone in on this. Tell us about the Herrin Massacre and how it really relates to the Birger Gang, the Sheltons, and the KKK.
Sure. As a matter of fact, the Herrin Massacre is in two of my different novels that I've written, because it's affiliated with the coal mine story, and it also has the gangsters because Bernie Shelton might have been there, but Ora Thomas definitely was there, who was one of the bootleggers. And what happened was the United Mine Workers were on strike, and the coal company decided to bring in steam shoveler union people to because down there they were scraping the coal off the surface. They were surface mining, not deep well mining. And so they had these people come in from Tennessee. They thought they were union people because they were steam shovelers. But to the United Mine Workers, they were strike breakers. So when they got in there, the coal company had gone up to Chicago and recruited a bunch of gunmen. Many of them were policemen in Chicago, and had them come down. Some of them were Al Capone's men. Had them come down and protect the strike breakers. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
And when they're protecting the strike breakers, the union people surrounded the coal mine in Herrin, and there were 600 or more men, women, and children, and were shooting at the steam shoveler, so they couldn't get any work done. And the gangsters from Chicago found that they were outnumbered. So in the middle of the night, and Glenn Young was probably one of those security guards, they snuck out in the middle of the night and abandoned the strike breakers. So when the strike breakers woke up the next morning, the 25 or so security guards, including Glenn Young, had snuck off into the night and gone back to Chicago or someplace. And so the people, the 600 men, women, and I keep saying children for a reason, they started shooting, and the strike breakers ran a flag up, a white flag, and said, "We surrender." And 50 of them came out with their hands over their heads, and all these men, women, and children surrounded them and started beating them. Well, that got under control, so they started marching. They said, "What are we going to do with them?" They said, "Let's march them into Herrin along the railroad track." And as they're marching them into Herrin, Illinois, with I don't know what they planned on doing with them at that time, United Mine Worker leader named Fox Hughes pulled up in a car, and he walked up to the leaders of this group, and Orr Thomas might have been among them, and said, "Listen, don't kill them out here in the open where everybody can see it. Take them into those woods and kill them there." And then he left. Well, that's what they did. They started taking them out one at a time and shooting them. And then they told the remaining ones, after they killed the main ones, they said, "You run for your lives, we're going to kill you." And they started shooting at them. That night, those 50 men had ran through the woods, and 19 of them died. Some were murdered, or some of them were hung. 6 of them were tied up and put into a ditch near Herrin, Illinois, near the cemetery. And they were all tied up together, like hogtied, and they were being beaten on. Little boys were urinating on them. People were spitting on them. And what one of my favorite stories is, because they're all wounded, they're shooting them in arms and legs and places that won't kill them. And a beautiful blonde-haired woman walks out of the house carrying a baby. She walks up to one of the men that are laying there bleeding and dying, and steps on him, and blood spurts up, and she laughs. That's just an incredible story to me. And then finally the policemen's come. They say the sheriff's coming, so a guy gets down in the ditch and cuts all their throats. But what's incredible is one of the guys, when he cut their throat, it hit the rope instead, and a guy named Patrick O'Rourke survived and testified against those men and gave names of the people who did it. And guess what? Not one person was found guilty of that.
No, small town justice, especially at this time. But I just think it shows, it just shows that history isn't clean, that history isn't easy. You know, there are a lot of stories of mine disasters at this time, mine massacres. I think there was one in Ludlow, Colorado. There are a lot of stories where those trying to unionize, the workers, were really treated horribly by the company, and they were shot and firebombed and murdered. But in this instance, it was the opposite. It was the scabs who were treated horribly by those who had unionized, and horribly meaning they were hunted down as dogs and killed and thrown in the ditch just to sort of have their bodies lie there until someone gathered them up. It's just horrific.
Sure. And I was lucky that I had the privilege of going to Washington, D.C. when and presenting my stories to Cecil Roberts, the president of the United Mine Workers and AFL-CIO, and Richard Trumka read it. He recently died here a year ago. And they gave good reviews of my book. And one of the things Cecil said that he really liked about it was that I show the good and the bad that the United Mine Workers did in their history. And, of course, the Herrin Massacre is one of the bad things. The Union actually took those 19 men that died and laid them out in a warehouse, and for 3 days, men, women, and children walked through and spit on them. People came from Chicago and St. Louis and all over the country, and newspaper men, and that made the United Mine Workers look bad. And in fact, they had a decline in membership right after that. Remember, the gangsters were involved in a lot of this, but people in Herrin kept that kind of a secret for years. They didn't want to talk about it because it made the people of Herrin look bad. And about 10 years ago, maybe it was 15, a guy named Scott Duty was a radio announcer. And Scott had a phone call and said, "What you want to," this is around Halloween or something, said, "You want to go see some ghosts or something, go down to the Herrin Cemetery and look for those 19 strikebreakers that were murdered." And Scott had never heard of it, but the next day he did that. He drove down to the cemetery to see if there was a marker or something about him, and a United Mine Worker came up to him, this is 10, 15 years ago, and said, "You better get out of here. We don't want these bodies found." Well, if you know Scott Duty, he was a DJ, and that spurred him on. He spent 4 years looking for those bodies. And he got archaeologists and all sorts of people to look for them. And they did find them about 5 years ago. And a guy named Steve Donasso with Indiana State University, an archaeologist and professor, was among them. And they dug up the bodies and buried them with dignity. They were just about to bury other people on top of the strikebreakers in a potter's field. Okay, and the reason I tell you that story is because my other book, Sundown Town, about Pana Massacre in 1898, Steve Donasso, the same guy, has been in contact with me, and he's looking for the bodies over in Pana of 5 black strikebreakers that were murdered, along with about 200 others, in Pana in 1898-99. And in the next year, he's going to excavate and find those bodies.
Oh, that's good. I will say that going to Herrin today, there is a sort of reluctance to talk about it. And there's been so many people moving in and out of Herrin. And right now, you're not even talking about the grandchildren of those involved anymore. You're really talking about the great-grandchildren by this time. And so you don't really hear a lot about it anymore, but you also don't feel like everyone's trying to hide it either. But I can definitely see why they would have made sure to tell you that the town is much more than that, and it's not at all like that anymore.
And actually, they do give tours now of the site of the Herrin Massacre.
And Herrin even has a Herrin Fest Italiana now, so it's sort of is pretty proud of its Italian heritage. And let's get back to the story. So who are Lori and Ethel Price?
Okay. Let's go on into the story of Charlie Birger after the Glenn Young the Ku Klux Klan gets wiped out, basically. There's a lot of other reasons besides what happened there. But now now we're back to warring gangs. Now you've got, with the Ku Klux Klan gone, the Birger and Shelton gangs start fighting over who gets the roadhouses, who gets the prostitutes, who gets Helen Holbrook, because Carl Shelton now starts dating Helen Holbrook, and Charlie's mad. Okay, that helped to cause friction between them. And Charlie also was from Russia. He's a Jew from Russia, and he asked Carl to help him bring his Jewish family back from Russia, and Carl blows him off. He won't do it. He won't help him, and that caused friction between them. The two actually wind up having a fist fight, and now they're mad at each other. So this is what's really great now. Charlie Birger takes his gang, and he builds a beautiful log cabin out in the middle of nowhere, and calls it the Shady Rest. And it's in the middle of the woods so that the Shelton gang can't attack him. So the Shelton gang decide, well, we tried bombing them a few times. They start bombing each other. They're shooting at each other. Gangsters are coming up dead in ditches and things. And then one day, Earl Shelton takes an old oil tanker, puts holes in the side of it, puts his men inside with guns, and they're driving around the countryside in this oil tanker like a tank, shooting at any of the Birger gangsters they can find, because they can't get them. They can't get them at Shady Rest.
I think we should stop here, and I just want people to really get a grasp of what you just said. We're at a point where they're basically hollowing out an oil tanker, putting holes in the side, and putting men in the back of an oil tanker to shoot through like it's a tank to get at one another. You also said that they're bombing each other. I want everybody to understand they're not just throwing bombs at each other. They're not just placing bombs in each other's cars and on the grounds. They're actually flying crop dusting planes over one another's territory, their land, and dropping bombs by hand. This whole thing has turned to a level of almost comic book violence that has just gotten bizarre by this point.
And that's one of the famous stories, is that there weren't many airplanes. So when one passed over back in those days, everybody looked up at it. Well, one of them lands near Benton or Herrin, Illinois, and Joe Adams, the mayor, is a friend of the Sheltons. So he takes the pilots to Carl Shelton and says, hey, I got an airplane here and these guys, and you can't get into Shady Rest because it's out in the woods. So what if you, and it didn't take much, Carl got Earl and Bernie to make some bombs, and they forced the pilot at gunpoint to fly them over Shady Rest and drop bombs on Charlie Birger's place. Okay? So now Charlie, and only one of them exploded, but it tore up his gambling place where he had dog fights and cockfights. So now Charlie starts getting paranoid. Charlie's on morphine anyway. Charlie's all kind of losing it in a way, because he's in the late 40s now, and he's starting to lose it a little bit. He lost his girlfriend. He's got people bombing his farmhouse and things. So he calls up Joe Adams when he finds out Joe Adams is kind of behind it all, and tells his wife answers, and he threatens her. He says, do you have any insurance on your husband? Well, you better go get some, because we're going to kill him. And then he sends two of his gangsters, two young boys named the Thomason brothers, and he gives them guns that are with poison bullets. And they go to the house, knock on the door, and when the mother comes, the wife, they hand her a note that says it's from Carl Shelton. In fact, we still have the note down in the Franklin County Coal Mine Museum in Southern Illinois in Benton. And the note says, help these boys get a job. Well, when Joe comes to the door, they pull out guns, the two boys did, and killed him. And then they run away. Well, Charlie's paranoid, so he starts thinking some of his gangsters are trying to might be turning on him. So one night, he gets 4 of the people he doesn't trust. One of them is one of the Thomason brothers who killed Joe Adams in the Shady Rest, and he burns it to the ground with them in it. Okay, his own place, because he figures, well, they're going to bomb me in the airplanes. I guess I can't be protected. Well, this is where you bring in that Lori Price guy. Lori Price is the first state trooper in Illinois who was killed in the line of duty. He had a beautiful young wife, and Lori used to run around with the gangsters. You know, he'd ride his motorcycle around and do tricks and things. And Charlie finds out that Lori knows that he might have burnt down the Shady Rest and might be involved in killing Joe Adams. So this is crazy. Charlie and his gang sneak into his house in the middle of the night. Lori and Ethel are in bed, and they're asleep. And when they wake up, they got this gang standing over them. And they tie them up, gag them, take them out to Shady Rest. Charlie shoots Lori Price, the state policeman, in the stomach, so he'll die slow. And then he puts him in a car and sits on him and drives him around the country looking for a place to get rid of his body. And finally, he finds a place and he machine guns him and leaves his body in the country. Meanwhile, he has some other gang members take Ethel. They take her out in the country. And since she's a beautiful young woman, you can imagine what happens. In fact, I talked to with their nephew not too long ago, and he agreed to let me tell the story the way I did. They rape her, and then they murder her and throw her body down a mine shaft near Carterville.
And Kevin, it not only seems apparent that Birger's starting to lose it at this point, but I think bigger picture, he's also starting to lose the war with the Sheltons at this point. Was there some sort of turning point in this war? Was it a lack of leadership? Was it Charlie's addiction to morphine? There are ebbs and flows throughout the entire story, to be sure, and this isn't just a story of violence, by the way. It seems like those ebbs and flows are often products of incarceration. You have extended periods and shorter periods where Charlie's incarcerated, and then Carl Shelton's incarcerated, and then Charlie's incarcerated again, and then Earl Shelton's incarcerated, and so on and so forth. But was there a moment in this narrative when the Birger gang really loses control for the final time?
You're exactly right. What I'm telling you right now is exactly the turning point. Charlie's into morphine. He's paranoid. He's afraid of some of his gangs. Remember, he's got the large gang. He's got lots of men. You can find photographs of them on the internet. And he's starting to worry. So he had Lori Price and his wife killed. He killed them. He killed Joe Adams. He starts killing people out of paranoia. He even supposedly, I believe that he poisoned Helen Holbrook because he thought she was cheating with Carl and helping him out. So now that's the turning point. And so now Charlie is brought in for questioning, and the sheriff lets it be known that he wants him to come in for questioning. And here's the amazing thing that your viewers will enjoy. Charlie says, "I'll come in only if I can have my Tommy gun in the jail cell with me in case the Sheltons try to have me killed." And the sheriff allows it. So the whole night, Charlie's sitting there caressing his Tommy gun, and the next morning, the sheriff takes him down into the courthouse and says, now we of course can't take guns in the courthouse. So he puts his gun down, they take him inside, and that's when the state's attorney tells him, "We're arresting you for the murder of Joe Adams." And so they arrest Charlie. They arrest one of his men named Rado Milich, who's also a Jew from Russia, and another man. And they try Rado for that and another murder that took place on Charlie's orders. And they hang Rado while Charlie's being held. And then in April 19th, 1928, Charlie Birger is hung. But the night before he's hung, the day before he's hung, they ask him if he has any questions or any requests. He gets a photograph taken with his wife and his children. He's got 2 beautiful young daughters, and then he that night he lets reporters come in and talk to him, and they take a photograph of him in front of the jail cell. Which, if you go down to Benton, Illinois, and see the Franklin County Coal Mine Museum, you can see the exact jail cell he was in. They have a replica of the gallows and everything, and his gun, his Tommy gun, and many other things. But the newspaper reporters asked him if he had what requests he has, and he said, "Well, for one, I don't want a white hood when I'm hung. I want a black one, so nobody will think I'm in the Ku Klux Klan." Which, and then the other thing he asked for is, he says, I want to be buried in a Catholic cemetery, so that the devil won't know where the Jew is, because he's Jewish.
Always interesting that Charlie was Jewish, because despite the story having, the typical gangster fare of booze and broads and bribery and the blood of Prohibition, there is a religious arc to all of this. It is also a battle between the Jewish gangster and the Catholics and the Southern Baptist. But this is a war of attrition that is eventually won by the Sheltons, in part, I believe, because they are family. So
sure,
I guess it begs the question, was there ever anyone that Charlie ever trusted like Carl trusted Earl and Bernie, his brothers?
Not that I could see. Connie Ritter, a man named Connie Ritter was one of his leaders. Art Newman and his wife were close to him, although they turned on him at the end. So he did not have anyone. He had 3 different wives, women he'd been married to, and it actually his first one, Edda was her name, came and visited him while he was in prison. So no, even his present wife, who was a very young girl, didn't come there at the end. The last thing we should say about Charlie when he got hung was, remember, they put the hood over his head, and Phil Hanna is an incredible character who's the hangman. He hung over 70 men in the United States, including the last public hanging in the United States. And Phil Hanna asked if he had any last words, and Charlie's last words were, "It is a beautiful world." And then he was hung. But yeah, we can go on. Now that's in my book, 13 Steps for Charlie Birger, which I tell about in your magazine from last year. And then the new book, Bootlegger Heaven, is about the Shelton Gang from this time of the hanging all the way up until they get killed. So,
well, I guess there are no happy endings in the world of gangsterism. I found it interesting that Hanna, the hangman, asked not to be paid.
Right. Phil Hanna was an interesting character himself, and I have a theory on him that people get mad at me, but I'll tell it anyway. When he was a young man, he viewed a public hanging, and it was so botched that the person that was hung was gasping and kicking and fighting at the end of the rope. And so he decided as a young man that he was going to build a foolproof hanging gallows and get the rope right and just do everything correct. And he did. He became a master of hanging. Now, he never asked for money, but he also said he would not be the one to pull the trap door. The local sheriff always had to do that. So, but I have a theory on him, and that is at every hanging, he asked for one memento from each of them. A lot of times he wanted the murder weapon. Now, I'm sorry, but does that ring a bell to you that like it does with me? What do you think he could be?
Well, the important question is what you think he could have been.
I'm wondering if he himself was a serial killer.
I definitely wouldn't be able to make that call, but it's an interesting perspective.
Yeah, if he wants to, serial killers like to keep one thing from each of the murders they have. So he's got that.
Mementos, yeah. But, there is a whole murder industry right now of collectors and writers and researchers. So it's, I don't even know what to say about that. But I think if I could have kept one thing at the Birger hanging, though, I think I would have wanted the hood.
Well, I think, I could be wrong, I think Sheriff Pritchard, who pulled the lever, and the one that got him to keep his Tommy gun in the cell with him, I think he wound up with the rope. And by the way, we just got the rope back a few years ago, and it's down at the Franklin County Jailhouse Museum.
So before we leave tonight, I need you to solve this long-standing controversy in Illinois, and that is, we always learned Charlie Birger was the last person hung in Illinois. I was recently reading that isn't really the case, that he was not the last man hung in Illinois.
Right.
What's the truth behind this?
Sure. Charlie was the last public hanging in Illinois. When he walked out to the gallows, there were 500 people inside the fenced-in area, and probably 10,000 people outside of it. If you look on the internet, you'll see people up in the trees, newspaper men, etc. I've got one photograph that I think is just amazing of a man that's so high up in the trees. The branches are so thin. I think, how in the world could he be standing up there on the top of that tree? So he was the last public hanging, and there was one other hanging that was right within a year after him in Illinois. And then, then they went to the electric chair. They started using it.
It surprises me that there was not more of an effort on someone's part. There's a lot of cross-pollination between these two groups, and especially since they worked together to defeat Glenn Young and the KKK, you would think that someone at some point that really started to see things go awry would have stepped up and said, hey, guys, let's just meet and find a way to divide this up, and we can all be the winners enjoying the spoils, rather than murdering each other and rather than having to pay exorbitant fees to buy off sheriffs. Let's just be one and make this work. Was that ever going to happen?
Charlie and Carl tried to meet a couple of times and discuss that possibility, but their personalities and different things about them prevented that from happening. I think they both saw it as a gold mine, and they didn't want the other one in there. Now, keep in mind, too, they weren't the only gangs. There's the Egan Rats from East St. Louis who were trying to get their foothold in this area. There's several different gangs. I'll just throw this out to you right now, just so you'll get, because this is such an incredible thing to me. In my research, I found out that there were some gangsters that were both in the Birger Gang and the Shelton Gangs. Their names were Fred Burke, Gus Winkler. They were the two main ones, and then there was about 3 or 4 others. These guys, after the 1930s, went up to Detroit and started kidnapping people. And then they made the mistake one day of kidnapping one of Al Capone's buddies. And when they called and asked for the money, Al Capone asked them to have dinner with him. So these guys have dinner with Al Capone, and he loves them because they're not Italian. He calls them his American boys. And he has Fred Burke and Gus Winkler and his men go and try to kill Bugsy Malone. No, I can't think of it right off. And that's the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And what's interesting is the Tommy gun that was used in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, we just found out in the last 10 years or so through ballistics that it is the same gun. That gun came from southern Illinois, from Little Egypt. So there's your tie. There's your tie with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre and the Shelton and Birger gang.
I had never heard that. That's interesting. But now that Charlie Birger is out of the way, you would think that the Shelton gang would joyously have a free and clear path to success for the remainder of their lives. Not so much, in that there are still men like Frank Wortman and Black Charlie out there. Tell us about, if you would, the fall of the Shelton gang.
Okay, well, that's exactly right. Buster Wertman, Frank Buster Wertman, and was in the the Shelton Gang, along with Black Charlie Harris. Well, Black Charlie Harris got on the wrong side of Carl, so Carl set him up by giving him some counterfeit money to purchase illegal booze with up in Detroit. And Black Charlie Harris got thrown in prison in Leavenworth for 10 years. And he hated them. Well, while he's in there, he meets Frank Buster Wertman, who had also been in the gang, and Carl had got him arrested for bootlegging. So he's in there too. And these two guys become buddies. So when they get out, they start working against the Shelton Gang. Frank Buster Wertman will become a big time operator and basically run all of St. Louis. In fact, if you want to go down there, if any viewers are in the area, by Carlinville, he has a house that's still there. It's not his now, of course, but there's a house that he built with a moat all the way around it.
I think that's right near Collinsville, correct?
Right by Collinsville. And people can still see it, but he was afraid that somebody would try to kill him, so he built the house with the moat, and he became the big wheel for St. Louis. Now, what happened was the Sheltons were doing pretty good in Southern Illinois, but then Bernie, in particular, wanted to expand out north. So he starts dealing in Peoria, Illinois. And when he goes up into Peoria, now that he's getting a little bit too close to not Al Capone necessarily, because he's in prison by now anyway, in the early 1930s. But the Capone men are still around, and they come down to Peoria and have gunfights with the Shelton Gang. And Bernie has a farm up there, a beautiful farm where he raises Palomino horses. Carl decides he wants to retire eventually, and he's down in near Fairfield, Illinois, where they're from, and he's got a mule farm. He likes to raise mules. And Bernie now kind of starts taking over things up by Peoria. And Bernie's not scared of anything. He was the enforcer for the brothers. He's the youngest, the meanest, the killer, I guess you'd say. So he starts running Peoria, and Carl stays at home a little bit more. Earl winds up getting shot, being one of the first to get shot. Black Charlie Harris shoots him while he's playing cards one day through a window, and he survives. Well, Bernie then is up there, and Bernie gets killed by Black Charlie Harris at a bar that's still there called the Shelton Bar. And there's hills on three sides of it, and Black Charlie parked his car up on the hill by the cemetery and walked through the woods. And when Bernie came up and was sitting in his car, when he got out, he shot him with a rifle. Bernie lived a little bit after that. He crawled up to the tavern. But if you go up there right now, I've got my books that sell up there, and they have pictures of Bernie and the Sheltons and everything. And it's still called, like I said, the Shelton Gang. It used to be called the Parkway Tavern.
So neat. So tell me, how important is historian and author Paul Angle to this whole story?
Oh, my. Paul Angle's the historian that we all kind of rely on. Paul wrote his Bloody Williamson County book, I think, in 1959. And it tells the story not just of the Shelton and Birgers, but the Herrin Massacre, the Ku Klux Klan, but it also goes back into the bloody events that before that, up down into the 1800s. So he was kind of the first guy to write about all these things. And then Taylor Pinsino, who's a good friend of mine, lives over in New Berlin. He wrote Brothers Notorious about the Shelton Gang. And he really did all the work. I mean, people can make fun of me. They should, because all I did was take all the research of Paul Angle Taylor Pensinel, a guy named Gary Daniil, who wrote about them. And I took their stories and I tried let me explain to you, the purpose of my writing is, I don't try to get rich on it or anything. I try to write the story in such a way that young people will become interested in it. As a history teacher, that's all I cared about. I wanted the young people, I wanted to put in a format. A friend of mine, Colin Davis, who's a historian around this area, didn't like it. He said, you need to write academic books. And I said, well, what's the greatest academic book about the Civil War? Well, people can't name that, but they can sure name Gone with the Wind, or...
Well, I definitely understand that thinking, having been in the history field for a long time, but I also think there's a place for historical fiction, and what happens in your book, of course, barring things like conversations between two people, which are sort of there for dramatic purposes and have to move the story along. What happens in your books actually happened. I've read 13 Steps for Charlie Birger. I will read Bootlegger Heaven, and everyone else should too. These are wonderful works of history, wonderful narratives, and microcosms of the American fabric at the time of Prohibition. But I think saying that they're not academic is being overly harsh, and I think what you've done is good, valuable work.
Yes, in fact, I include, if you look at the back, I've got all the events that actually occurred and tell what order the dates that they occurred in. So even the smallest detail, like the little girl who is at church and she's the sheriff's daughter, and the sheriff all of a sudden is paranoid because they can't find the little girl because he says Carl Shelton stole her. He kidnapped her. Well, Carl was there at the church, and so he and his men go out and start looking for the little girl, and they finally find her underneath a church pew asleep. And that's a true story. So everything, detail I could think of, even how Earl Shelton rolls his money up into cabbage shape, things like that. I try to keep as much as I can to be true, just to inspire people to learn more about these eras that we're talking about.
Okay, it's time to do the business. I am here with author Kevin Corley, wonderful writer, nice man who knows an immense amount of information about Charlie Birger, the Shelton Gang, the Herrin Massacre, and what was going on in Southern Illinois, as I've said all night, a microcosm of America in the time of Prohibition. So where can everyone find your books, Kevin?
Well, the easiest way, of course, is Amazon. Amazon's got them in both Kindle and in paperback. The paperbacks, we sell them for $15. The reason we don't try to sell them for a lot is because we want people to read it and learn the history. That's it. Now, something you need to mention, you've got some friends down there or some people that grew up with you in Southern Illinois that are very interested in this story. John Malkovich, the actor, is from Benton, Illinois, and he would make a great Phil Hanna, the hangman.
I know, and this whole story would be a perfect mini-series or streaming series or film. Oh, my gosh.
It will be. It will be. It will be. And Ben Moses, the Hollywood producer who helped with Good Morning Vietnam with Robin Williams, he's done lots of documentaries. He's done lots of game shows and things as a producer. He's very interested, and he wants to pitch it as a TV series or a movie, probably a TV series, because they're so involved. I'll be glad just to see it made into a story. And a guy named John Musgrave from Southern Illinois has a thing called IllinoisHistories.com. He's a historian, and he is also very active in the film industry, and he's also working on this type of project. So I just appreciate you asking me to write the articles. I've really had fun writing them. I tried to make them condensed to where they're clear and easy to understand, but would hopefully be an interest to the readers.
Once more, we are with author Kevin Corley, Corley. You can find him on Amazon. The books are 13 Steps for Charlie Birger and Bootlegger Heaven. You should definitely get those if you want more on this story. And there is more on this story. So I want to thank Kevin so much for being on the show. Thanks, Kevin.
Well, thank you for having me.
This is St. Patrick on the Midnight Rider News Show. From the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
Freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. You only choose sides based upon the rhetoric. The truth is nefarious, the slow flow of evidence and lies on both sides. Got to admire their cleverness. But the code of personality is venomous. The power keeps ascending, agendas are so treacherous. They 10 steps ahead of us, cementing their survival. And y'all just applaud and fall for these false idols who slither through the snake pits, dark shadows and shape shift. Devalue the paper, less power for you to play with. State agents operating so flagrant. Suits and jackboots for us peasants and vagrants. Leviathan monster, federal mobsters. Socioeconomic warfare tactics divide and conquer. Stop and ponder for a minute how they prosper. Insert them in disguise and you don't realize what they sponsor. They rotate the scapegoats, stockpiles of banknotes. Control everything from lab coats to fake votes. Smile in your face when they strip you of your freedom. Continuously telling you lies, why you believe them. Government conditioning, dunk down education. The school to prison pipeline fueling incarceration. Speak in pursuit of the truth and be met with violence. Because one way or another they want to obtain your silence. Common sense questions they never want you to ask. Like how much can they take with some beer and a mask? And the ultimate hypocrisy is that they're spreading freedom and democracy by supporting corrupt corporate monopolies. Mainstream media ain't telling the truth either, but you entertained by their high-stakes kabuki theater. Pit us against each other, watch us burn it down to ashes. Just another way to gain influence over the masses. Military weapons.